Welcome to Shaker Museum, Mount Lebanon. This exhibition, Break Every Yoke, Shakers, Gender Equality, and Women's Suffrage, celebrates the centennial of women's suffrage in New York State. The Shakers were founded in Manchester, England in the mid-18th century by Anne Lee, the illiterate daughter of a blacksmith and a cotton factory worker. We know little about her early life, except that she was forced to marry and quickly lost 4 children, either in childbirth or infancy, which surely played a part in her insistence on celibacy as a main tenet of the Shaker faith. Facing persecution in England, the Shakers immigrated to America in 1774, eventually settling near Albany. In 1787, they established their first organized community at Mount Lebanon. The Shakers eventually spread to more than 19 settlements, and at their height in the mid-19th century, they numbered over 6,000 individual believers. Lee established a precedent for female leadership. Freed from the reproductive imperative, female Shakers had exceptional control over their own bodies and health, and were not compelled to devote years of their lives to child-rearing. They were therefore free to realize Lee's vision of dual leadership of and full participation within the religious and secular activities of Shaker society. In 1781, Anne Lee and 5 followers set out on a 2-year journey through New England to visit recent converts and proselytize new ones. This map chronicles that journey. The Testimonies asserts the dual nature of God, both male and female, and the parallel between Jesus Christ and Mother Anne Lee. These relics were carefully preserved and passed down among generations. One Shaker wrote, "Unborn generations who come to Mother's fold may feel some satisfaction this relic to behold, to know that Mother saw it and held it in her hand, to know it crossed the ocean with her from Britain's land, will please her faithful children and bring her spirit near." An oral history of Anne Lee gathered from those who knew her, this book was intended to connect current Shaker leaders with the original teachings of Lee. In the era of manifestations in the 1830s through 1850s, some Shakers received messages from the world beyond. One expression of these messages from the beyond was transcribed messages of encouragement and support intended for individual Shakers. This note from Mother Anne was for Sister Amy Reed. Another expression of these communications from the spirit world was a form of writing thought to be comprehensible only to those under spiritual inspiration. This card is believed to represent Mother Anne Lee's name. Anne Lee is buried in the cemetery at Watervliet, and several Shakers created collaged remembrances of their visits to her grave. Shaker girls and boys received an equal and sound education, an extraordinary fact in a time when access to education was limited not only by gender, but by wealth, class, race, and geographic location. From the late 1830s through the early 1850s, the Shakers experienced the era of manifestations, in which there was a wave of mystical messages from the other world, including from Anne Lee and various departed church leaders. Called gifts, these visitations manifested in drawings, hymns, dances, or even spells of laughing or spinning. Shaker sisters received these gifts in far greater number than the brothers, and the messages gave the sisters considerable spiritual authority. Up until this time, sisters had little opportunity to write on theological topics, and this period gave them the opening to express themselves on matters of the spirit. The sisters' educational foundation, combined with the influence that accompanied these divine messages, solidified and advanced women's roles in the community. Amelia Culver was brought to the Shakers at age 6 by her parents, along with 8 siblings. The only member of the family to remain with the Shakers, Culver is best remembered as an educator. Amelia Culver, pictured leaning against the teacher's desk at the back right of the photograph, taught the Shaker girls at Mount Lebanon from 1867 until 1887. In 1866, when Amelia Culver was an assistant teacher in the girls' school, she was granted a 1-year teacher's certificate by New York State. The school commissioner found her, quote, moral character, learning, and ability to instruct a common school, end quote, sufficient to receive certification. Amelia Culver's collection of more than 1,000 biographies includes ones on leaders in female education Emma Willard and Laura Bridgman, prison reformers Elizabeth Fry and Dorothea Dix, temperance leader Jenny Willing, abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, and women's suffrage leaders Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Laura Holloway, and Lucretia Mott. While Shakers generally held property in common, some personal items, such as clothing, received labels with individuals' names. This printed label was probably intended to identify one of the books Amelia Culver used in her role as a teacher. This essay is one of the few items Amelia Culver published in a standalone publication. She was, however, the author of nearly 50 articles, mostly printed in the Shaker magazines The Shaker and The Shaker Manifesto. This transcription of a biblical verse from the book of Matthew, created by Amelia Culver, demonstrated calligraphic penmanship and was likely hung in the school. Polly Reed was one of the most prolific scribes of messages from the spirit world during the era of manifestations. She recorded songs in manuscript and created drawings like this one, all gifts from deceased Shaker leaders. Polly Reed was assigned to record spiritual messages during the Shakers' era of manifestations. Her exceptional penmanship and attention to detail made her an ideal scribe. Polly Reed kept this account of daily events, including deaths, comings and goings of fellow Shakers, and the work done by the sisters. All Shakers, male and female, were expected to work according to their ability for the good of the community, and tasks were often divided by gender. The Civil War and industrialization caused a reduction in the number of male Shakers, and the sisters crossed gender boundaries to take on more and more of the work in the late 19th century, increasingly driving the economic health of the communities. Shaker sisters manufactured various styles of cloaks that became popular and stylish among non-Shaker women. The sale of cloaks at Mount Lebanon brought in the modern-day equivalent of more than $3 million over nearly 50 years. E.J. Neal and Company marketed its product widely. This photograph was used not only in print advertising, but also as the image on the woven label sewn into the collars of cloaks. E.J. Neal and Company made an average of 132 cloaks per year from 1890 through the beginning of the Second World War. While the materials were costly, labor was cheap, and the cloaks were a significant source of income for the Shakers. This photograph shows a sewing room used for making cloaks at Mount Lebanon. Emma J. Neal, front left, is shown with 6 Shaker sisters. This portrait of Emma Neal was made from an earlier cabinet card portrait done by photographer S.S. Wheeler of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The company that made the woven silk labels for E.J. Neal and Company also manufactured bookmarks woven with an image of the trustee's office at Mount Lebanon on it. The Hart and Shepherd catalog and price list for Shaker sweaters provided not only prices, but also a list of the variety of sizes, weights, and colors available. This knitted wool sweater in navy blue or Yale blue was made by the Canterbury, New Hampshire Shakers. Shaker sisters also produced botanical medicinals, including nearly 24,000 bottles of Norwood's tincture of Veratrum viridae, one of the largest selling medicinal preparations in the world at the time. This publication describes the uses of Veratrum viridae and contains numerous testimonials for its effectiveness. Norwood's tincture of Veratrum viridae was derived from American hellebore and used in the treatment of rheumatism. The word poison was added to the labels after the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. This vat was used for mixing medicinals made from barks, flowers, leaves, and chopped roots of various plants soaked in a solution. The Shakers had been famous for their chairs, but as the number of male workers declined, 2 women at Mount Lebanon became largely responsible for the business, one manufacturing the chairs in the workshop and the other creating the webbed seats. Remember the fast that God doth require. Let his holy word the whole nation inspire. Undo heavy burdens, relieve the oppressed, break every yoke, and your souls will find rest. These words, written by Shaker sister Hannah Brownson in a poem published in 1861, refer to the Shaker belief that those who are in bondage, whether women, slaves, or the poor, must be freed in order to achieve the Shaker ideal of perfection on earth. Women's equality and voting rights were among the ethical issues that needed to be resolved in order for heaven to exist on earth. Women, strengthened by nearly a century of equal education and full participation in economic and spiritual matters and governance of the communities, led Shaker involvement in various progressive causes in the mid to late 19th and early 20th centuries, including abolition of slavery, pacifism, and women's suffrage. The sisters often had the support of their brothers. In 1888, one Shaker man publicly called for an all-female Senate, an all-male House of Representatives, and a man and a woman to share the presidential duties. Catherine Allen's parents serially joined communal societies. They were living at the Modern Times colony on Long Island, New York, when they sent Allen and her brother to board with the Shakers. Allen elected to remain there for the rest of her life. Allen set aside traditional Shaker values of isolation and a quiet internal life to argue widely for women's rights, women's suffrage, and the humane treatment of animals. Catherine Allen described the Shaker family as, quote, a sweet home of congenial activities and companionships where government is parental, the father-mother love beautifully manifests through conscientious, intelligent, large-hearted leaders who know what it is verily to be the servants of all, end quote. In this history of the Shakers, Catherine Allen includes a section titled, Ann Lee was the pioneer of the woman movement, introducing Lee's revolutionary idea that God was both male and female. Allen goes on to show how the Shaker government reflected this idea in its dual male and female structure of leadership. Anna White was a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Council of Women. She was also deeply involved in progressive causes such as vegetarianism, pacifism, and the prevention of cruelty to animals. She wrote extensively on these topics as well as women's rights. This is the last general history of the Shakers written by the Shakers themselves. The authors emphasize various social movements in which the Shakers were involved. Anna White wrote, "The bloodless diet would seem a natural outcome of the simplicity, purity, and kindness of the Shaker faith and practice." Robert White, father of Anna White, gave this poem to the Lebanon Shakers in the 1850s to hang in their barns. This photograph shows Anna White addressing the Peace Convention. The audience is a mix of Shakers and non-Shakers. The Shakers' Peace Convention in 1905 encouraged international arbitration and a proportional reduction of armaments among all nations, leading finally to the limits necessary only for the maintenance of an international peace force. The resolutions were sent to President Theodore Roosevelt and members of Congress. Shakers signed this declaration opposing the War of 1812. The Shakers believed God commanded them to abstain from acts of violence and that every citizen had the right to act according to his or her own conscience. Camp meetings in the late 19th century had evolved from merely religious revivals to gatherings of people interested in various progressive causes, from vegetarianism to spiritualism. The Shakers attended to learn and to seek converts. The Shakers, having received spirit communications during the era of manifestations earlier in the century, were very interested in the emerging spiritualist movement in the late 19th century. A delegation of 34 Shakers attended this meeting.